The objectives of this lecture is number one, to review the physiology of sodium and fluid balance, to review the common causes and clinical manifestation of fluid and electrolyte disturbances. Hopefully, we can review as well preoperative management of fluid and electrolytes, as well as postoperative management of fluid and electrolytes in a surgical patient. So what is total body water? Total body water is the amount of fluid, okay, in our body. Okay? So as you can see in the diagram, we have there male and female. The total body water component for a male is different for a female. Okay? Since male are more muscular, okay, in some or more often than not, the male body has more fluid content, which as shown there is 60%, compared to a female, which the fluid content is around 55%, the entire total body weight. Okay? So the total body water is further subdivided into compartments or located in two compartments, mainly your extracellular fluid compartment and your intracellular fluid compartment. So the extracellular fluid compartment, okay, which contains 20% of the total body water, or 1/3 of the total body water, is further subdivided into your intravascular fluid or your plasma and your interstitial fluid. The intravascular fluid compartment, these are the fluid content inside your vessels, mainly your artery and your veins. Your intracellular fluid compartment comprises 40% or 2/3 of your total body water, both of which totals to the 60% total body water. This is a table or a diagram lifted in your Schwartz. It shows the percentage of total body weight and the corresponding volume in terms of your total body water in a 70 kilogram male and 60 kilogram female. So you just have to follow the computation in terms of computing the percentage, and you will come up with the total 4.2 liters for 42 liters, okay, per male and 30 liters per female total body water. So this is the computation. So total body fluid. Okay. So for this computation, the reference is for male, since it's 70 kilogram. You multiply that by 60%, since that is the total body water. You will have a total body fluid of 42%. To compute the extracellular fluid the fluid in the extracellular fluid compartment, you have to multiply it with 20%. For the intracellular fluid compartment, just multiply it with 40%. Okay. Total plasma volume, okay, since we all know that the intravascular fluid compartment and the plasma is the same, it's 5%. Total blood volume, later on, we'll discuss how to compute for total blood volume. Okay. And total interstitial fluid, or the other 15%, is we compute first the ECF, then subtract the total blood volume, then you will get your total interstitial fluid. So very simple mathematics. So this table shows the different total body water in different conditions. Okay. So as you can see, you have a normal state, an obese state, a patient that is starving, and a patient in critical care unit. More often than not, these patients in critical care unit are immunocompromised or with severe conditions warranting intubation, multiple medications. Okay? And as you can see, the total body water, okay, increases depending on the state, except for obese patient. Okay? So our reference would be the normal state, wherein you would have total body water would be 60%, and fat content is around 20%, protein content 14%, and the rest would be divided into carbohydrates and other around 1%. For obese patient, it's self-explanatory, the fat content increases in comparison to your water. Okay? That is why there is decrease in the total body water of around minus 5%. But of course, it depends on the severity of the obesity. We all know how to compute that. The what is that? Obese type 1, obese type 2. Okay? And in a patient who is starving, okay, typically cancer patients because of cancer cachexia, or patients with gastric outlet obstruction or any form of obstruction, or patients who cannot tolerate oral intake. Okay? So, of course, they will lose fat because of preferential use of fat and protein to produce glucose. There will be decrease in protein content and fat content. Therefore, total body water increases. Same thing for critically ill patients. Since patients who are considered critically ill, the duration of time that they are starving or without oral intake is longer compared to just starvation. There is further decrease in the protein content in the body and the fat content. More so with protein, there's also increase in total body water. So again, for obese, less total body water per unit of weight and a relatively expanded ECV compared to ICV due to the relatively low water content of adipose tissue. And for elderly, body water composition is also altered such that by 80 years of age, okay, total body water contributes only 50% of the total body weight. Why? Because for elderly, there is already atrophy of muscles, and the majority of water is inside your muscle cells. That's why there is that's why there is decrease in the total body water for elderly. At the same time, there is increase in fat content, okay, in elderly population. And due to decreased food intake, so this table, okay, it just shows the total body water as a fraction of total body weight in different age group and population. Okay? So, as you all know, upon birth, okay, infants should have their around 80% of their total body weight would be water. And as they grow older, or as the days, weeks, months goes by, this total body water decreases. Okay? So when they reach childhood, total body water would be 65%. Adult male, as discussed, 60%. Adult female, around 55%. Elderly male, around 50%. And elderly female, 45%. So what this table just shows is as you grow older, the total body water decreases as well. So now we go to the normal blood volume. Okay? So the normal blood volume in our circulation okay, as mentioned earlier, is 5.6 liters in a normal 70 kilogram meal. So 84% of which is used in our systemic circulation. Then the remainder, or the 16%, is being used in the cardiopulmonary circulation. Okay? So here you can see the different distribution within the systemic circulation and the cardiopulmonary circulation. So if you're gonna ask how much blood, okay, do I have in the body? So approximately 5.6 liters of blood. Okay. So this is how you compute it. Okay. With this formula, total blood volume equals total plasma volume times the fraction of 100 over 100 minus hematocrit. Of course, you have to know the weight of the patient and the hematocrit level. You have to request for the hematocrit level. So that's how you come up with 5.6 liters of blood. So after the total body water, now we talk about the electrolyte composition per fluid compartment. Okay. So now we know that we have two compartments, mainly your extracellular fluid compartment, which is composed of your intravascular space or your plasma and your interstitial space. Okay? So for the extracellular fluid compartment, you have your cations and your anions. I'm sure you're already familiar with this. This was discussed during your physiology class when you were in first year. So the major cations in your extracellular fluid compartment would be your sodium. And the major anions would be your chloride and your HCO3. On the other hand, the major cation in your intracellular fluid compartment would be your potassium, and the major anion in your intracellular fluid compartment would be your phosphate, sulfate, and your protein. Later on, we'll be discussing the importance of these cations and anions and how it is being balanced in our system. So again, for reiteration, so the extracellular fluid compartment, major cation would be your sodium, major anion, chloride, HCO3. In the intracellular fluid compartment, major cation is your potassium, major anion would be your phosphate, sulfate, and your proteins. So what are the functions of your cations and anions? Okay. So this is just a table showing the different physiologic functions that balance the fluid between the compartments we've discussed earlier. So the major electrolyte responsible for fluid balance or for osmosis would be your sodium. Your potassium is responsible for neuromuscular excitability as well as for acid-base balance. Calcium for bone development and blood clotting. Okay? Magnesium is responsible for different enzymatic reactions, cellular enzymatic reactions. On the other hand, the anions, the counterpart of sodium for fluid balance and osmosis would be your chloride. For acid-base balance, your bicarbonate. Proteins is also responsible for osmotic pressure or balance of fluid between compartments. Phosphate, energy storage. Going back to your biochemistry, we all know that phosphate is very important in the different cellular cycles, which produces energy. Sulfate for protein metabolism. Before we talk about the different balances and how it happens, you have to know the Starling's law. Okay? So the two fluid compartments mentioned, okay, the extracellular fluid compartment and the intracellular fluid compartment, are separated by membranes that are freely permeable to water. Okay? So it is governed by your hydrostatic pressure and your osmotic pressure. So it depends on these two components, okay, how fluid will move from one compartment to the other. Okay. Hydrostatic pressure deals with the pressure brought about by the amount of, okay, electrolyte in each compartment. Okay. Osmotic pressure, concentration of solutes on each side of the membrane. What are these solutes? These are your electrolytes. So again, this membrane is only permeable, freely permeable to water. Electrolytes and molecules, okay, would need a carrier protein or a driving force for them to move from one compartment to another, unlike water. What is osmolality? It is the concentration of solution expressed as the total number of solute particles per kilogram. Okay. It is a measure of solute concentration per unit mass volume. So how would you explain this? It's just like when you're making a juice, right? The water is your solvent and the solute would be the powdered juice. So it would depend on the balance. Okay? It will be concentrated if you put too much powdered juice. Okay? It would be diluted if you put less juice, powdered juice compared to water. So in our body, okay, water is the one, okay, that will, okay, try not to make the concentration too diluted and more or too concentrated, or what we call osmosis. That is why there is movement of water from one compartment to another. It wants to balance everything all the time. Again, it is dictated by the osmotic pressure. Okay? The osmotic pressure would depend on the concentration of the solute on the compartment. So osmolality is measured in different values. When we talk about millimoles per liter, that is the number of particles per unit volume. Milliequivalent is the number of electric charges per unit volume. Since sodium has +1, that is the equivalent, milliequivalent measurement or value for it. Sodium chloride is considered one particle. So that's 1. Milliosmoles, okay, is the number of osmotically active ions per unit volume. Since sodium is one active ion and chloride is another active ion, that's why it's 2 osmotically active ions. So when we talk about milliosmoles, okay, number of particles in sodium chloride is always together, that's 1. Milliequivalent is the electric charge of that electrolyte. Okay. Milliosmoles, number of osmotically active ions per volume. So don't be misled with this when you read values, millimoles, milliequivalents, and milliosmoles. So how do you compute for serum osmolality? Again, this is a standard default computation for serum osmolality. 2 times sodium plus the product of the following. Glucose divided by 18 plus BUN divided by 2.8. Of course, you have to request for serum sodium, serum glucose, and BUN. Okay? The rest are standard values. Okay? So, for example, you get a serum sodium of 140 millimoles per liter, glucose of 110 milligrams per deciliter, and BUN of 20 milligrams per deciliter. The total osmolality or serum osmolality would be 293.2 millimoles per liter. Okay? So as we all know, the normal serum osmolality is around 290 to 310 millimoles per liter. Okay? So that's the normal value. Later on, this value, okay, will be, okay, our reference, okay, to say if a fluid is hypoosmolar or hyperosmolar. So now we go to body fluid changes. Okay? So a healthy person consumes an average of 2 liters of water per day. Approximately 75% from oral intake and the rest, okay, extracted from solid foods. So even if you're not drinking too much water or fluid, okay, you still get fluid from what you eat. On the other hand, daily water losses include 800 to 1.2 liters, okay, in urine, okay, which is the principal mechanism for maintaining fluid balance or water balance. Approximately 250 ml in stool, and 600 ml in insensible losses. Later on, we will explain what are these insensible losses. But by the name itself, insensible, these fluid losses cannot be quantified. Unlike your urine that can be quantified if you measure it, as well as with stool. So this diagram, okay, just shows, okay, that in a human being, there should always be a balance between fluid intake and fluid output or losses. Okay? It should be in hemostasis or homeostasis. Okay? So tilt in one side, okay, would render different reactions in the body. So either input from oral fluid intake, from food, then losses from urine, sweat, stool, and other insensible losses. So again, this is table from Schwartz. Okay. As you can see, it just shows the average daily volume that an average 70 kilogram male consumes. Oral, fluid, solid, food, insensible intake. We also have insensible output. So no need to memorize this. It just shows how fluid is being balanced in the body. So insensible losses amounts to around 8 to 12 ml per kilogram per day and are divided into respiratory and cutaneous water losses. So by merely breathing, okay, you lose water. By sweating, you also lose water. And that's why it is insensible because you cannot quantify that. Okay? So majority of which you lose from cutaneous losses. Of course, this will be increased if you do any form of exercise, strenuous activities that makes you sweat more. For lungs, around 25%. In certain cases as well, these are increased when you are hyperventilating or in critically ill patients, when they are intubated, okay, respiratory losses increases as well. So these are increased such factors as fever, increase in metabolism, and hyperventilation. So how does the body know when there is changes in fluid, mainly in the extracellular and intracellular? Actually, more of the extracellular fluid compartment, and most especially in the intravascular space. Okay? So these are sensed, okay, by your osmoreceptors and baroreceptors. Okay? Osmoreceptors, okay, these drives changes in thirst and diuresis through the kidneys. By the word osmo, okay, it detects changes in the concentration of solutes. On the other hand, baroreceptors, these are sense changes through specialized pressure sensors, okay, located in your aortic arch and carotid sinuses. Okay. Responses are both neural and hormonal. Okay. So baroreceptors sense changes mainly in your blood pressure or the amount of fluid, okay, that is going back to the heart. So, as I mentioned earlier, sodium is the major cation or the major solute that will determine fluid balance. Okay? So, these are the different organ system that senses decrease in sodium concentration, or these are the osmoreceptors, right? As well as baroreceptors, and how they would react. For example, in the kidney, the major component responsible would be your juxtaglomerular apparatus. It sends, okay, when it sends there is low sodium or low volume, it releases renin. So it follows the renin-angiotensin system or your RAA system. Okay? Then it gets converted. Your angiotensin, this would be angiotensin 1, gets converted into angiotensin 2, which eventually will stimulate the release of aldosterone. Later on, we'll discuss how aldosterone, okay, increases volume. So we just have to review how this works. Again, I'm sure this was discussed during your physiology class. So this is just a diagram, okay, showing how all of these works together. Okay. The neurohormonal responses in changes in your electrolytes and fluids. So again, if there is decrease in sodium or increase in potassium in the blood, okay, it has a direct stimulating effect in your adrenal gland, specifically at the zona glomerulosa of your adrenal cortex. There would be enhanced secretion of your aldosterone. Your aldosterone takes its effect in the kidneys and would make your kidneys increased absorption of sodium. Hence, your water will follow your sodium. Then there would be increased potassium excretion. The end product would be increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. So your pituitary gland, okay, secretes ACTH, which has an effect on the adrenal gland as well. For volume, okay, if there is increased blood pressure or increased blood volume as sensed by your baroreceptors, Okay. It will increase, okay, your ANP or your atrial natriuretic peptide, and this will have inhibitory effect. It will try to lower down sodium and water reabsorption. We have increased blood pressure or increased blood volume. Another diagram, more complex diagram, okay, showing if there would be drop in blood pressure or low sodium chloride concentration and low extracellular fluid volume. So these are the different organ system that will try to compensate. You have the liver, kidney, lungs, adrenal cortex. Okay. It follows the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, your RAAS. After activating the RAAS, okay, angiotensin 2, which also a potent vasoconstrictor, okay, it will constrict, okay, your vessels, prompting increase in fluid or volume delivery to the heart, which will try to increase, okay, blood pressure. Actions in the pituitary gland, specifically the posterior pituitary, which will eventually increase vasopressin. The vasopressin will increase the aquaporins in the tubule system in the kidney, increase sodium absorption across the ascending loop. So as you increase sodium absorption, water will also follow. Hence, there will be increased water in the bloodstream, eventually trying to correct again, drop in blood pressure, okay, and decrease in extracellular volume. Angiotensin 2 also, okay, will send signal to the brain and tell you that you are thirsty. Hence, you will increase fluid intake. Again, we'll try to correct the decrease in blood pressure or the decrease in concentration or volume in the fluid balance. So the first two diagram talks about decrease in volume and serum concentration of your sodium and chloride. Okay. This diagram, okay, shows naman when you have fluid overload. If you have increased blood volume, okay, or if you have increased blood pressure, okay, so there will be distension of the baroreceptors. Okay. There will be sympathetic stimulation or stimulation from angiotensin 2. Your ANP and your BNP would be activated. Okay. This will lead to vasodilation, opposite of the angiotensin 2, which is vasoconstriction. Then there will be drop in blood pressure because the veins will be dilated. Blood will pool in your peripheral veins. Hence, you would have decreased blood pressure. ANP and BNP, okay, the opposite of your RAA. Okay, there will be decrease in renin, decreased angiotensin 2, decreased aldosterone, hence decrease in sodium reabsorption. There will also be decrease in water reabsorption. There will be diuresis because of that. More sodium is being filtered, or more sodium will go to your urine, and water will follow sodium. So there will be diuresis or natriuresis. Then eventually that will lead to decrease in blood volume. So before we proceed with the surgical fluid requirements, we'll have a 3-minute break. So since we're in surgery, we're gonna talk about the
Okay, break muna tayo guys. 5 minutes. Is that okay with you or you want to continue? Anyone? No response. So be back. We'll continue after 5 minutes. Okay, shall we resume? Are you guys still there?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay.
Surgical fluid requirements. So for the surgical fluid requirements, appropriate management of fluids and electrolytes in the perioperative period. When you say perioperative period, okay, that includes preoperative, before surgery, during surgery, and post-operative period, after the surgery. This requires a flexible yet systematic approach to ensure that fluid administration is appropriately tailored to the patient's changing requirements. So hindi siya dekahon, or there is no standard approach in assessing, computing, and managing, okay, fluid requirements in a surgical patient. Again, it should be dictated on the age of the patient, on the comorbidities of the patient, on the weight of the patient, as well as the disease pathology the patient has. And the fluid requirements, okay, should take into consideration the following: deficit, maintenance requirements, and any ongoing losses. So me personally, this is what I used for computation of the maintenance fluid requirement. I think they also use this in pediatric patient. I think in IM, they have their own formula. I think weight times 35 or weight times 40, depending on the case of the patient. So this is a table. So for the first 10 kilogram, you multiply, sorry. Yeah, for the first 10 kilogram, okay, you multiply 4 ml per kilogram per hour. Okay. Then, no, baliktad. For the first 20 kilogram, you compute 20 ml per kilogram per day. Then the next 10 kilogram would be 50 ml per kilogram per day. Then the succeeding, okay, would be 4 ml per kilogram per day. Anyway, we're not gonna ask you to compute the total fluid requirement or the maintenance fluid requirement. What are the deficits? Okay? This is the approximation of perioperative fluid losses or preoperative fluid losses or approximation of intraoperative blood loss. Okay? And fluid losses from, okay, your insensible losses via either evaporative, okay, via your respiratory and your cutaneous losses, and what you call your third spacing, wherein fluid from your intravascular space would be sequestered in your interstitial space. Okay? So again, as I mentioned earlier, fluid assessment in a surgical patient should be done in the perioperative, the preoperative phase, the intraoperative phase, and the postoperative phase. Okay? This statement, okay, just want you to know that when you infuse IV fluid or crystalloid, for example, you give 1 liter of crystalloid, not all of that 1 liter of fluid will go to the intravascular space. Since, as discussed earlier, the extracellular fluid compartment is composed of your intravascular and or your plasma and your interstitial fluid compartment, which is 2/3. So majority of that fluid infused to a patient will go to your interstitial space. Only 1/3 to 1/4 of that fluid. So for every liter of fluid infused, only around 250 to 300 ml will go to the intravascular space. The rest would go to your interstitial fluid compartment. That's why if you want to replace 1 liter of blood loss in a patient, for example, who underwent surgery and there's blood loss, or trauma patient where there is blood loss, in order for you to replace that volume, you have to give at least 3 to 4 liters of IV fluid just to replace 1 liter of blood. Because of the concept that 1/3 to 1/4 of that fluid will go to your interstitial space. Okay? But if you replace, okay, it with the blood, 1:1 yung ratio. Because blood is pure blood, it will not pass the membrane, it will not shift to your interstitial space. So again, third spacing, this happens during extensive dissection at the oppressive site. It induces a localized capillary leak, the result of which is extravasation of intravascular fluid into the interstitium with edema formation. But edema formation only happens if there is too much fluid leaking from your intravascular space going to your interstitium. This is just an approximation of how much fluid would leak to the interstitium or how much third spacing, depending on the type of surgery. For example, inguinal herniorrhaphy, 4 ml per kilogram per hour. For aortic aneurysm repair, around 8 ml per kilogram per hour. So the more extensive, the more complicated the case or the surgery, the more third spacing that will happen because of the severity of the injury. Third spacing also happens in the presence of infection, inflammation, or burns. I think if you still remember our discussion of our lecture before, that one of the things that happens is there is capillary leaking due to the inflammatory reactions or due to the effect of the inflammatory mediators. So fluid will leak to the interstitial space. Third spacing may persist as long as 24 hours into the post-operative period or maybe even longer. It depends on the overall state of the patient. And it should be considered as part of ongoing losses in the immediate post-operative period. So this should be taken into consideration when you're assessing how much volume you have to replace in a patient immediately after surgery. Again, sabi nga, it should be a balance. There should be balance between fluid intake and fluid output or losses. So now, let's now go to the ongoing fluid losses. Usually represents as GI losses from stomas. Stomas are your ileostomies, colostomies, tubes if you have NGT drain, if you have JP drain or peritoneal drains, chest tube drains, or even your Foley catheters, fistulae or fistulas in the presence of enterocutaneous fistulas and the likes. Not just fluid are being lost in these instances. There's also loss in electrolytes. So the electrolyte composition of the output depends on the source of the effluent. So this is a table showing how much electrolytes are being lost per volume loss depending on the source or the effluent. So for stomach, if you are vomiting continuously, 1 liter to 4.2 liters, you would lose around 20 to 120 mg of sodium, 130 mg of chloride, 10 to 15 mg of potassium, and 30 to 100 mg of hydrogen. So it depends on the effluent or the source of the fluid loss. There is a corresponding electrolyte losses, which is very important in managing the surgical patient. But again, we're not going to discuss on how to compute how much sodium you have to give, how much potassium how to give. When you are in, I think, clerkship, we will discuss on how to compute and how to replace these electrolytes on top of how much volume you have to give and what type of volume or what type of fluid you have to give in a patient. What is important at your level that to know is it depends on the effluent, the amount of electrolytes being lost varies. So the replacement of fluid or the replacement fluid should be chosen to best approximate the composition of the ongoing losses. Okay? Nasogastric losses are typically replaced by your normal saline solution plus KCl. Why? Because as mentioned earlier, okay, if you have gastric losses, you also lose, okay, potassium as well as chloride, not just your sodium. And as we know, normal saline solution, okay, is purely sodium and chloride only. There is no potassium in your normal saline solution. You can also replace nasogastric losses if it's purely gastric, but if it's venous, you can use as well plain LR, which has potassium content, but lower sodium chloride content. Losses from a duodenal fistula may be best be replaced using lactated ringer solution or your plain LR. So before replacing fluids and electrolytes, okay, you have to evaluate and assess your patient first. Okay? Again, this is tailored, okay, based on your patient's status. Okay? Number one, you have to reassess the patient frequently, determine the intravascular volume status. This is very important. And how do you assess this? Okay? Clinically, you assess the heart rate, the blood pressure, and most importantly, the hourly urine output. So all know if you have decreased blood volume, you would have increased heart rate, decreased blood pressure, as well as decrease in the urine output. Okay? The normal urine output, okay, in an adult is 0.5 cc per kilogram per hour. So in a normal 70 kilogram male, you expect at least 35 to 70 cc of urine output per hour. For pediatric patients, it's around 1 to 2 cc per kilogram per hour. Okay. Orthostatic vital signs, okay. Traditionally or before they use this to assess, okay, volume status. Okay. What happens is there would be a significant orthostatic change, okay, and it's defined as the increase in pulse rate of at least 30 beats per minute and decreased systolic blood pressure of greater than 20 mmHg, or patient would experience dizziness upon standing. So you have to get the vital signs of the patient lying down. Then afterwards, you ask the patient to stand up. Okay? If there would be orthostatic changes, then it's an indirect assessment of a decreased fluid status for your patient. The hematocrit level, okay, use of hematocrit to estimate blood loss is unreliable and inappropriate. Okay? Decreases in hematocrit in the early hours after acute blood loss is usually the result of volume resuscitation rather than ongoing blood loss. Okay? Because if you have blood loss in surgery, then you infuse fluid, of course, your hematocrit will be diluted or your blood would be diluted. Then there would be decreased hematocrit level, even if you have achieved already the volume status that you want. So it's not that reliable to use as the hematocrit level as assessment tool for fluid balance. We also use invasive hemodynamic measures, okay, especially for very extensive surgeries or in critically ill patients. We use your CV catheters or central venous catheters, which measures your CVP, your CV central venous pressure. Pulmonary artery catheters, okay, This allows measurement of cardiac output and systemic oxygen transport. Acid-base parameters, okay, provide information about the adequacy of tissue oxygenation. So if you have decreased blood volume, okay, what happens is there would be decreased delivery of hemoglobin or oxygenated hemoglobin to your organs or periphery. Then there would be shift of from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. Then you would have increase in lactate. Okay? Increase in lactate, okay, would be perceived as there would be acidosis. So that's another measure in assessing the fluid status of your patient. So disturbances in fluid balance. Okay? Extracellular volume deficit is the most common fluid disorder in surgical patients and can be either acute or chronic. Okay? Usually, acute manifestation would have cardiovascular and central nervous system signs. Okay? Chronic, okay, you would also have cardiovascular, central nervous system, as well as signs that would give you decrease or signs such as decrease in skin turgor and sunken eyes. As you all know, in pediatric patients, if the patient is chronically dehydrated, okay, you can assess that by checking the skin turgor and if the patient has sunken eyes. Extracellular volume excess may be iatrogenic or secondary to renal dysfunction or congestive heart failure or cirrhosis, wherein there is failure to diurese. Okay? Congestive heart failure, okay, there is leaking of fluid, okay, to the lungs, okay, because of failure of the heart to pump the blood to the periphery. Classification of acute blood loss, I think you would have a separate lecture with regards to hemostasis and bleeding. So this is just a table showing the severity, depends if it's type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, the amount of blood loss, okay, the percentage of volume loss, okay, and the clinical manifestations. So just read on this, try to memorize. It's very important, especially in the clinics when you see a patient, if you're dealing with blood loss, given these clinical parameters, you would be able to assess how much blood loss, okay, the patient had and how much should be replaced. Ongoing fluid losses, again, just repeat slide, reiteration that depending on the effluent, okay, you have to pick the right fluid or IV fluid to use to replace depending on the effluent and the electrolyte composition. So these are the different types of your IV fluid. It comes in different shapes, in different volumes, and they are color-coded. So this is just a table of the different common IV fluid and its electrolyte composition. You have your 0.9 NaCl or your normal saline solution. You have the D5, okay, NSS or your NSS with dextrose. You have 0.45 NaCl, 3.0 NaCl, your lactated ringers, and other D5 containing fluid. Okay? So this is a table. Okay? No need to memorize this. You have to familiarize yourself. Okay? So your normal saline solution is the most common IV fluid for maintenance. Again, for maintenance, okay, because it is isoosmolar. Isoosmolar meaning to say it is closest to our serum osmolality, which is 290 to 310. Having its osmolality is 308. Next would be your lactated Ringer solution, which is slightly hypoosmolar with 275, okay, milliosmoles per liter. The rest, especially your D5 containing fluids, okay, are hyperosmolar, considered hyperosmolar already. And the osmolarity is dictated by the electrolyte content of these IV fluids. Okay? So if you can see, how did they come up with 308? They just added sodium and chloride. 308. For lactated Ringers, has less sodium, less chloride, but has potassium, calcium, and lactate. But it's slightly hyposmolar. But in the clinics, we use for fluid resuscitation and for maintenance fluid in a surgical patient, more commonly your normal saline solution and your plain lactated Ringer solution. Okay. Now, in providing fluids, okay, or in fluid resuscitation, okay, again, it would depend on what type of patient you have. Since we're dealing with surgical patients or we're in surgery, okay, you have two types of patient that you will see that will require fluid assessment, and you need to provide fluid preoperatively, intraoperatively, and postoperatively. Of course, you have patients who will undergo elective surgery. More often than not, these patients, okay, preoperatively has normal fluid balance in comparison to patients who would need or who requires to undergo emergency procedure. Okay? Usually, these patients are often dehydrated. When you see these patients due to vomiting or obstruction, or because the patient cannot tolerate oral fluid intake, or there is ongoing bleeding. So assessment and computation of fluid varies. Of course, if it's an emergency case, automatic preoperatively there is ongoing losses already. Okay? So you have to take into consideration, okay, that losses or the loss, okay, and compute for the fluid that you will provide to this patient. For elective cases, no problem. Usually no losses yan. So you just have to give their maintenance fluid requirement. Okay? So now, let's go to the electrolytes. Okay? So the typical individual consumes about 3 to 5 grams or 100 to 250 mg of dietary salt per day. Is balanced by sodium losses in sweat, stool, and urine. Again, just like fluids, okay, your electrolyte intake should be balanced with your electrolyte losses. Kasi pag hindi ka naglo-lose niyan, masasobrahan ka naman. Okay? There would be significant increase in the concentration of this solute. What will happen if there is increased concentration of this solute? You will retain fluid. Okay? Sabi ko nga, water will follow sodium and chloride wherever it goes. So in the perioperative period, adequate maintenance of sodium may be achieved with an intake of 1 to 2 mg per kilogram per day. Normal potassium intake is approximately 40 to 120 mg per day, approximately 10 to 15% of which is excreted as normal urinary losses. So sodium in, potassium out. You all know that. Okay? So when you absorb sodium in the renal tubules, okay, potassium would be excreted and vice versa. Body potassium stores can be maintained with an intake of approximately 0.5 to 1 mg per kilogram per day. So you all know what is next, the electrical charge of potassium. So now we talk about disorders in sodium balance. These are changes in serum sodium concentration that is inversely proportional to the total body water. By definition, hyponatremia is having less than 135 mg per liter. Okay? The values ranges from 125 to 130. Okay? You will already have or rarely have life-threatening complications. For severe hyponatremia, less than 120 mg per liter, okay, these are associated with irreversible neurological complications. That's why electrolyte balance is very important as well. So again, this is from your Schwartz. Okay? This diagram only shows that hyponatremia, okay, you can have hyponatremia in different volume status. Okay? Volume status, high volume status, normal volume status, or even low volume status. Okay? And these are the different conditions wherein you would have hyponatremia in different volume status. Just review on this. But the most common form of hyponatremia would be your hypovolemic hyponatremia, wherein you have low volume status and low concentration of serum sodium, either due to decreased sodium intake, okay, increased GI losses or renal losses, use of diuretics, or primary renal disease. So what are the clinical manifestations of hyponatremia? Okay, depending on the organ system. Okay. For the CNS, headache, confusion, hyperactive, hypoactive, deep tendon reflexes, seizure, coma, okay, and the rest. Again, this is in your Schwartz. Just review this. This might be in your exams. So, if you have hyponatremia, how do you manage it? Okay. First, you have to assess sodium deficit. Okay. And this is just one of the available computations or formulas in computing sodium deficit. 140 minus serum sodium multiplied by 0.6. Okay. 0.6 is what? 60%. That's the total body water times body weight in kilogram. So for females, you use 0.5 since the total body water is around 50 to 55%. So don't worry. Okay. This is just nice to know for your level. So as I mentioned earlier, hyponatremia can be present in different volume status. You have your hypertonic occurs in the setting of hyperglycemia or elevated BUN, which induces a shift of water from your intracellular fluid compartment to the extracellular fluid compartment. Okay? So if there is increase in blood sugar or elevated BUN, okay, the serum concentration or solute concentration in your intravascular space will be higher in comparison to your intracellular fluid compartment. Okay, your body will detect that. What it will do, okay, water will go from your intracellular fluid compartment, then will go to the intravascular compartment or intracellular fluid compartment. How will you produce hyponatremia? It will be diluted. Okay. Serum sodium in comparison or will be inversely proportional to water. Since water will try to balance the concentration of the two compartment, there wala naman additional sodium. So nagkakaroon ng hyponatremia. Okay? Due to the increase in serum concentration of your sugar and or your BUN. Okay? So each 100 milligram per deciliter rise in serum glucose or 30 milligram per deciliter rise in BUN correlates to 1.5 to 2 mg per liter decrease in serum sodium. Serum sodium is not lost. Okay? It's because water, okay, will move from the intracellular fluid compartment to the extracellular fluid compartment, mainly in the intravascular space, okay, to balance the solute concentration. And it becomes diluted. That's why when you request for serum sodium, mababa yung serum sodium. Isotonic, meaning normal yung serum osmolality. Okay? This happens when you have pseudohyponatremia, if you have extreme hyperlipidemia or hyperproteinemia. Okay? Hypotonic, okay? Again, most common may occur in the setting of hypovolemia, euvolemia, or hypervolemia. Okay? Hypotonic because decreased yung volume as well as decrease yung concentration ng electrolytes sa intravascular space. Treatment, okay, for hypovolemic hyponatremia, of course, aside from electrolyte resuscitation, you have to give fluid resuscitation as well. Okay? Volume, you have to give volume and electrolyte resuscitation. So for euvolemic hyponatremia, okay, hindi naman ang problem dito is fluid. So fluid restriction and careful monitoring of serum sodium and volume status. Okay? So either there is sodium loss lang. So in severe cases, okay, judicious use of 3% normal saline plus loop diuretics to increase serum sodium by 0.5 to 1 mg per liter. For hypervolemic hyponatremia, okay, if mataas yung volume, so you have to give water restriction, okay, with or without loop diuretics. So for hypernatremia naman, okay, this is defined as serum sodium greater than 145 mg per liter, okay, invariably associated with hypertonic states. You can have hypovolemic hypernatremia, okay, due to losses such as vomiting, diarrhea, forced diuresis. Euvolemic hypernatremia, free water loss via the lungs, skin or open wounds or from diabetes insipidus. Hypervolemic hypernatremia, most often iatrogenically induced from resuscitation with hypertonic fluid. So if pag sobra-sobra yung napibigay mo fluid sa patient, okay, then you would have increase in volume as well as increase in serum sodium. Lalo na pag your body cannot, okay, adjust, okay, in terms of renal adjustment, wherein pag na-detect niyang oops, mataas na yung volume, oops, mataas na yung serum sodium, kailangan niya nang mag-diurese or hindi i-reabsorb yung sodium. So more often than not, in renal patients, you would see hypervolemic hypernatremia. Clinical manifestations, okay. So just review it again. Anyway, you have a copy of my PowerPoint as well. So for hypernatremia, regardless of the cause, treatment is free water replacement. You just have to dilute it. Okay? You have to give free water. So for hypernatremia, unlike for hyponatremia wherein you compute for the sodium deficit, for hypernatremia, you compute for water deficit. And this is the formula as well. The rule, okay, when correcting hypernatremia, you give 1/2 of the water deficit, okay, over the first 24 hours, then the remainder should be given over the next 24 to 48 hours. And serum sodium should not be reduced by more than 0.5 mg per liter per hour to prevent cerebral swelling. So you have to take into consideration all these things when you're in the clinics already, when you're correcting patients with hypernatremia. So now we go to disorders in potassium balance. Okay? So by definition, hypokalemia is having, okay, less than 3 mg per liter of serum potassium. Most often the result of abnormal losses. Okay? So again, we go back again to the previous slides wherein there is a table showing the amount of electrolytes lost per body effluent and for volume of that body effluent loss. Okay? This is often accompanied by hypomagnesemia, thus correction of magnesium is essential. Etiology of hypokalemia, either inadequate intake, excessive potassium excretion, or due to GI losses. So if there are rules in sodium correction, there are also rules in potassium correction. So just the same for hyponatremia, hypokalemia, you compute for the potassium deficit. Make sure the patient is hydrated before you give your potassium replacement. Okay. Use of peripheral line should not exceed 10 mg per liter or 10 mg per hour. Okay. What does this mean? If you're gonna give potassium replacement, okay, of more than 10 mg per hour, okay, you should use a central line, not a peripheral line, because you would have chemical burns when you use your peripheral line. So if you're giving more than 10 mg or when you're doing fast correction, you should use a central line. What central lines? Either IJ catheter, internal jugular vein catheter, or a femoral vein catheter. If you're gonna correct more than 20 to 40 mg per hour, mandatory to have the patient hooked to a cardiac monitor, because we all know that potassium, okay, is a major electrolyte for cardiac excitability. So if you're giving too much, pwedeng magkaroon ng arrhythmia yung patient. So you should hook the patient to a cardiac monitor if you're giving fast correction or very fast correction using 20 to 40 mg per hour of potassium. So this is just how I compute potassium deficit. There are multiple ways of computing it. It depends on you, what fits your practice, and by experience, what gives you the best result after correcting. Ideal minus actual times 100 plus the maintenance plus the losses. See, you have to take into consideration the maintenance potassium based on the weight of the patient and the amount losses. So you have to know, okay, where the losses came from. Usually surgical patient, if it's vomiting, diarrhea, okay, or fistula, or NGT drains. Okay. So you include all losses. Okay. It needs to be corrected over 24 hours. Then after correction, you have to repeat your serum potassium. Then correct accordingly with IV incorporation versus side drip. Okay. So we're not gonna discuss further on that. Hyperkalemia, on the other hand, is interpreted as more than 5 mg per liters. Acute rises in potassium can cause fatal ventricular dysrhythmias. Okay, kaya nga sabi ko kanina, when you're correcting potassium deficit or correcting hypokalemia, okay, and you're giving fast correction or doing fast correction, you have to hook your patient in a cardiac monitor. Causes, okay, renal failure, acidosis, insulin deficiency, rhabdomyolysis, cell lysis, okay? Or some drugs can cause hyperkalemia, okay? Or some conditions such as ischemia, reperfusion syndromes. Pseudohyperkalemia also happens, okay, when you send a specimen to the laboratory, then it's already hemolyzed because, diba, the major cation in the intracellular space would be potassium. Pag nag-hemolyze yun, tataas yung potassium. Okay, etiology for hyperkalemia: increased intake, increased release, impaired excretion. Release from, okay, of course, if you have acidosis from the intercellular compartment, there would be shift. Okay? Potassium will go out towards your extracellular compartment. Impaired excretion, okay, your potassium-sparing diuretics or renal insufficiency, wherein you cannot absorb sodium, sodium in, potassium out, di ba? So nangyayari, sodium out, potassium in. Treatment, of course, you have to remove all potassium-containing fluids. Ano lang ba yung fluids na nandun sa table natin na walang potassium? Your NSS and your D5 water. The rest, they have potassium. Obtain ECG, and if it changes consistent with hyperkalemia, okay, you give 10% calcium gluconate IV to stabilize the cardiac membrane. Okay. The most rapid treatment is to induce transcellular shift of potassium into the cells. You give D50-50, 1 up D50-50, then 10 units, okay, of insulin. Ang nangyayari dito, okay, potassium will parang gagawin niyang co-transport yung insulin, and it will go to inside the cell. So from the extracellular fluid compartment, it will go to the intracellular fluid compartment in trying to decrease the serum potassium. Definitive treatment, of course, you have to eliminate potassium from the body. Either loop diuretics, or in case of renal failure, or if everything fails, all these steps, okay, you've given all these measures, and you still have persistent hyperkalemia, then the only way to remove that serum potassium is do hemodialysis. Another way to remove potassium from the body, okay, is through excretion in the stool, okay, or you give polyestyrene sulfonate, wherein there would be sodium-potassium exchange. It is a sodium-potassium exchange resin. But we rarely do this method in decreasing serum potassium. Hey!
So are there any questions? Any clarifications?